of the critical concerns in providing an equal opportunity education for American children is how to best educate emergent bilinguals. The No Child Left Behind Act attempted to bridge the achievement gap with a standards-based approach. But in Miami-Dade County, one of the nation's bilingual hotspots, was this policy really effective? Florida has the third highest number of English language learners, or ELLs, in the United States. This amounts to over 250,000 students. Many of these students are located in South Florida. In Miami-Dade County, approximately 1 in 5 students enrolled in public schools are classified as having LEP, or limited English proficiency. According to the chief academic officer in Miami-Dade, the county spends more than $20 million annually to educate bilingual children, a larger budget than every Florida county combined. The history of language policy in the United States is filled with controversy and has undergone dramatic shifts throughout the last century. Contrary to popular misconception, the U.S. actually has no official language. The first attempt at passing a federal language law was in 1923. Drafted by Congressman Washington J. McCormick, this proposed legislation would have made American, as opposed to English, the official language of the United States. In 1965, on the heels of the Civil Rights Movement, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was passed. In 1968, the ESEA was expanded to include the Bilingual Education Act, which was the first federal policy that recognized the need for equal educational opportunity for ELLs. The BEA provided schools with funding to establish innovative bilingual programs and options for both English and native language development. But not all legislation was this progressive, even in the diverse city of Miami. In 1982, Dade County voters approved an anti-bilingual ordinance. This controversial law required all public documents and meetings to be in English and prohibited the county from using funds to do business in any other language. This law was in effect for over a decade, until it was repealed in 1993. Quality and accessibility of bilingual education in Florida remained unequal until the Florida Consent Decree was passed. In 1990, groups under Multicultural Education Training and Advocacy, Inc. filed a class action suit against the Florida Department of Education. This coalition alleged that the Florida Department of Education had failed to offer equal educational opportunities for ELLs. The result was the passing of Florida's Consent Decree. This law provided flexible guidelines for educating ELLs through a modified curriculum with a focus on literacy development. In 2002, the No Child Left Behind Act became the first law to replace the Every Student Succeeds Act. First proposed in Congress, it received overwhelming support by both Democrats and Republicans and was later signed into law by George W. Bush. At the time, it was thought to be a savior for a public school system that struggled to compete internationally. No Child Left Behind was a standards-based education reform. In other words, its philosophy was that setting rigorous standards for students would lead to better educational outcomes. A major objective of No Child Left Behind was to increase the federal government's role in education in order to make sure standards were being met. This was done by introducing rigorous standardized testing, strict requirements on teacher qualifications, and sanctions for schools that did not meet state standards. Replacing the BEA, Title III of No Child Left Behind created new regulations about bilingual education. These rules emphasized state accountability and scientifically based research to make sure ELL students were meeting standards for English proficiency. Title III aimed to meet these goals with a few main approaches. First, Title III granted $30 million in funding to schools with ELL students. These funds were specifically directed towards services and materials for ELL programs instead of being added to a general fund. Next, Title III introduced strict accountability measures. Standardized tests were used to ensure schools were cooperating and required a 95% participation rate for ELLs. This held teachers, principals, and superintendents directly responsible for ELL's academic progress. Also, data from standardized testing was collected to provide important information on how to direct resources and measure academic progress. Finally, Title III mandated that federally funded programs must use educational materials that are based on scientific research. Regulations were tightened for what kind of educational research could be used, and the idea of what constitutes scientific research was redefined. Supporters of No Child Left Behind hoped that its enforceable guidelines and emphasis on high standards for underserved groups would draw much-needed attention to educational development of ELLs. However, in the years to come, Title III would face harsh criticism by educators across the United States. No Child Left Behind's language policies have been denounced for being regressive and scientifically unsound. First, the educational philosophy of No Child Left Behind largely discounts the role of a child's native language in English acquisition. Research has shown that using learners' native languages in the classroom is highly beneficial. In additive bilingual classes, where native language development is a priority, students develop better English abilities than those in English-only or ESL classes. These students go on to perform academically on an equal or even higher level compared to native English speakers. However, No Child Left Behind makes little to no mention of native language development, leaving ELLs held back in both languages. Next, the rigorous testing required by No Child Left Behind does more harm than good. The Act applies sanctions for schools who don't perform up to standards, removing their funding. In addition to sanctions, struggling schools may have to remove staff and offer funds for students to go to private schools. With each year, sanctions become more severe, and the most disadvantaged schools receive the highest penalties. Also, when teachers' job security depends on their students' math and English test scores, they prioritize these subjects at the expense of a well-rounded education. Under No Child Left Behind, schools have slashed arts, PE, and even social studies from their curriculums. What was supposed to be an incentive for high standards academics became an education of basic skills. Finally, Title III requires that educational practices are based in scientific research, but its policies are often out of step with established educational practices. For example, researchers have maintained that ELL testing guidelines lead to unreliable scores. While some states developed specific assessments in ELL's native languages or offered accommodations, most schools nationwide required ELLs to be tested in English. Unsurprisingly, ELLs tend to score poorly on these tests. If state assessments are not a valid measure of progress, the standards become arbitrary, and education becomes more about obtaining equal test scores than equal opportunities. Though Florida had one of the largest ELL populations in the U.S., public schools were largely unsuccessful in establishing Title III policies. This was partially because its requirements were rigid and unscientific, and because Florida schools failed to honor federal standards. One major oversight of Florida's implementation process was that they did not develop an assessment that was tailored to the needs of ELLs. Accordingly, 96.6% of Florida high school students in LEP programs did not achieve a passing score in standardized reading tests. These assessments are known as high-stakes testing, as they determine whether students can graduate or advance to the next grade. As the overwhelming majority of ELLs were not able to pass state tests, Florida's secondary-level ELLs were held back twice as often as the national average and had the third lowest graduation rate nationwide. Second, Florida classrooms failed to comply to state standards. No Child Left Behind didn't specify a specific method of instruction for bilingual classrooms, so this was left up to the states. In Florida, the most common method was inclusion. In this model, ELLs are placed in English-speaking classrooms with an ESOL-trained teacher. However, in Florida, requirements were not consistently enforced. A report from the State Board of Education found that 1/3 of ESOL teachers did not hold certifications in their subject. Additionally, Florida standards required that a bilingual aide must be present in classrooms with 15 or more ELLs. In Miami-Dade County, this regulation was found to be inconsistently enforced. Overall, Florida State did not do enough to ensure their schools were meeting the needs of ELLs. Third, Florida's educators took issue with Title III's policies because they were in conflict with established educational practices. Teachers reported that, since state tests are highly reading-focused, literacy began to dominate curriculums in schools. This instruction was generic and decontextualized and didn't allow students to develop vocabulary and comprehension in real-world settings. Its high level of structure meant that teachers couldn't tailor lessons to their students' specific needs. Thus, standardized testing under No Child Left Behind limited teachers' professional freedom, giving them no choice but to use flawed educational practices. Finally, No Child Left Behind required that data gathered from state assessments should be used to hold schools accountable and to direct funding to best serve ELLs. But the state of Florida was found to have inaccurate and insufficient monitoring of ELL students. Analysts reported that Brevard County schools did not have accessible data on ELLs or an established process to monitor their educational performance. Combined with invalid testing procedures, Florida was left with little data to accurately direct resources and measure the progress of ELL students. Teachers, families, and scholars agree that No Child Left Behind was a policy failure. So what does an effective bilingual education framework look like? Florida, Texas, and California, home to the majority of the nation's ELLs, have offered their own approaches on this issue. A promising example of bilingual education policy is the Castañeda Standard. This model was developed in 1981 when a group of Mexican-American families sued their school district for segregation. Castañeda offers a set of standards used to determine whether schools are fulfilling the educational needs of ELLs. Like No Child Left Behind, educational theory, school accountability, and teacher qualifications are central. What sets Castañeda apart is its emphasis on instructional reform. That is, the Castañeda Standard seeks to identify the deeper causes of ELL's underperformance, instead of enforcing arbitrary standards and sanctions. Despite its setbacks during the No Child Left Behind era, Miami-Dade County has been home to one of the most innovative bilingual approaches. Founded in 1963, Coral Way Elementary School is the first bilingual public school in the United States. This school was created to serve the influx of Cuban refugees in Dade County. Coral Way used a dual immersion philosophy to encourage bilingualism. In this split-day plan, one half of the school day was taught in English and the other in Spanish. The Cuban students were functionally fluent in English within 1 year. Within 5 years, their test scores were on par with monolingual English-speaking and Spanish-speaking students. Today, a progressive option for bilingual education policy might grant funding for programs like Coral Way to encourage development of both English and native languages. California, after 20 years of restrictive English-only laws, has introduced new legislation on bilingual education. The English Learner Roadmap is a comprehensive policy developed to clarify best practices on teaching ELLs. It requires school districts to consider parent and community input and includes guidelines on how these requests can be monitored. The roadmap uses current research on bilingual education to outline procedures on how schools can create ELL programs. Unlike No Child Left Behind, the English Learner Roadmap shows commitment to honoring the best practices for bilingual education, as well as ELLs and their communities. While the No Child Left Behind Act may have been well-intentioned, it ultimately reduced educational quality and consideration for ELLs. As the ELL population continues to increase, establishing a comprehensive bilingual policy will become more important than ever. Going forward, a successful policy needs to include 3 key components. First, it must show an understanding of the nuances of bilingual education, taking the input of researchers, educators, and communities into account. Next, it should require accurate monitoring of educational progress to create accountability without penalties. Finally, the policy should provide funding for programs that foster academic achievement and English acquisition, without neglecting native language development. With these basic principles, a new bilingual policy will better be able to meet the goal of closing the achievement gap between native English speakers and ELLs.